Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Molly O'Brien. Thank you for joining me here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'd like to say hello and welcome to Ron Powers. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's a true pleasure to have you here. I told him I have to try to squeeze everything in, all of his accolades. So Ron Powers is a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic. He's also an Emmy-winning TV commentator, a New York Times best-selling author, and you might recognize a few of his titles: Flags of Our Fathers and True Compass. Ron is here joining us today to talk about his most recent book, No One Cares About Crazy People: The Chaos and Heartbreak of Mental Health in America. So again, Ron, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about this book. I want to jump in by saying this is a deeply personal book that you wrote.
It is.
And it's one that you said you never had any intention of writing. You didn't want to write it, but here we are today.
Here we are.
So tell me about that. What led you to write this book? It took you about 10 years.
The book is about schizophrenia, serious mental illness. And in 2005, the youngest of our two children, whose name was Kevin, a gifted musician, gave in to the affliction by hanging himself in our basement in the town of Middlebury, Vermont, where we lived. My wife, Anna Ray, and I had tried to steer Kevin, along with medications and psychiatrists, through 3 years of this affliction. When it hit, we just didn't know where it came from. We were as ignorant as it's possible to be. My wife is a PhD in biophysics, but it's the kind of disease that people really don't want to know about. It's a disease that is easy to deny, and because of that, a lot of families are suffering in silence because they feel that if they talk about it, they further a kind of stigma. But that's not. And I wanted the book. I wanted the book to be an open door between them being what I call the sub-nation of afflicted families, and the general population, because we have to break down the barriers of ignorance and denial and understand what we need to give to allow these people and their families to lead decent, humane lives. I just need to say that we lost Kevin, and then a couple of years after that, his older brother, Dean, came down with the same affliction. Luckily, it wasn't as dire, as serious as Kevin's, because his psychiatrist gave him a really fine medication regimen that involved injections. It's really important to know that one of the companion diseases that strikes people with schizophrenia is something called anosognosia. It's a Greek term. It just means lack of insight. And what it means is that about 50% of schizophrenia sufferers believe they're fine. No need to give them meds. It's the rest of the world that's crazy. And that was true with Kevin. He very quietly is a sweet, gifted young man. No troubles, no alienation or anything. But when the disease hit, after a while, he began to hide his oral medications. So we thought he was taking them. Dean fell into the care of a very perceptive psychiatrist who realized, adolescent boys don't like to admit that they're ill. And so he said to Dean, if you will come to the clinic's office once a month for an injection of a drug called Haldol, you'll be fine and you'll recover. If you don't, you go back to the hospital. And Dean has fulfilled his obligations to that injection ever since, and it's made a world of difference.
A world of difference. What has it been like for you to learn from your family's experience and to be able to dig in, because you've done a lot of research for this book, and then to be able to share your heart-wrenching experience of your family with other people who have gone through these sorts of things?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, for the first 10 years, I said, I'm not going to write this book. I'm not going to touch it. For the first 5 years, I could barely move after Kevin died. We were and are a very close family. He was so dear. He was he was such a starburst of talent and guitar gifts. And I said, what is
And
there?
you share that in the book. He shares stories, so it's
Yeah,
wonderful.
oh.
You get to know your family.
Yeah, that's right. When I did decide to write it, my second pledge to myself was, I'm going to keep my family out of this. The reasons were, I don't want to commodify my dear sons and my wife. I don't want this to be a money-making book. I don't want it to be a poor daddy book. If I'm going to write it, I will talk about the nature and the history of the disease, the ideologies that clash around it. Is it a disease or is it fantasy? Lots of things to talk about. And not until the contract was signed did my literary agent and the publisher say, you must include the boys. And as soon as they said that, I said, you're right.
Yeah.
One thing that Dean and Kevin do in the book, I think, is they put an endearing human face on schizophrenia. I wanted to show them not as victims, but as burgeoning, happy little boys before it hit, because one of the superstitions about schizophrenia is that it hits people who are alienated or depressed or alcoholic or in some way on the margins of society, and that is not true.
Not
it
true at
strikes
all.
anybody.
Yeah.
Can I talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't?
Of course.
Yeah. Another important thing to realize, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, these are a family of diseases that are physical in nature. They're not just bad moods, they are genetically inherited. They're passed along through the genes, and they afflict, some say 1 in 100, now people are starting to say 4 in 100 people. If you have that fatal cocktail of genes, you can still go through life and not know that you have these genes, but if an outside force such as stress comes into the mix and activates a lot of chemical business in the brain, that's when it starts. And one of my messages today, I guess, Mary, is to urge parents, if the kid starts showing strange behavior, maybe it's adolescent rebellion and maybe it's not. Early diagnosis is so important in minimizing the effects of a disease like schizophrenia.
You know what I would like to talk about, and I think you're spot on, early diagnosis. Don't ignore something
Right.
that's there, right?
Right.
Because you can get help. You can definitely get help in whatever way, shape, or form that your family chooses to go with that. I want to talk about the title of the book because it is striking, and you jump into things right off the bat. There's no tiptoeing around things in your book.
Right.
The title is very striking and very emotional for people who are. So what I'm going for here when I'm talking about the title is some people this title will sicken them. Some people would agree with the title, and I think that's what's very emotional about this.
Yeah, it can sound disdainful, it can sound off-putting.
Yeah.
It isn't.
And because someone on a political person actually wrote this sentence in an email. Talk to me about your title.
The title is a passage from an email that was written by an administrative aide to a man named Scott Walker of Wisconsin in 2010. He was county chairman running for governor. At the same time, the Milwaukee County Hospital was undergoing a scandal, the likes of which we haven't seen since Bedlam. Inmates were being starved, inmates were being raped, inmates were committing suicide. It was a horrible thing. The people around Walker didn't want it to taint his campaign, so his aide, a woman named Kelly Rindfleisch, writes a memo to her colleagues saying, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. No one cares about crazy people. When I read that, the world around me went red. And when my head cleared, I thought, there is my title. There is the goad that's going to stick me. Whenever I get frustrated or tired of writing this, I'm going to finish this book, and I want it to be in every airport in the country, and I want Kelly to travel a lot. And I want her to see that title because it's an abominable title. And yet, there's truth in it. People, it's not that they don't care, It's that they are terrified of the insane. They equate insanity with violence, which is not true. It's about the same percentage of people within the general population who are violent as are insane. And I think there's also an unconscious tendency to think, and this is really crucial, I believe, they're not quite human. Their craziness has reduced them to something other than a human being. And so therefore we really don't have to worry about spending a lot of government taxpayer money to help their situation, their living conditions, their medication. They are human. I can attest to that from very personal experience. They're capable of pain and sorrow and a little bit of joy. And I really believe that it really is our duty as a civilized society to reach out to that sub-nation, as I call it, and do what we can to make their lives comfortable and safe, and give them the opportunity to reclaim themselves. It can happen.
What's so sad about that is not only the verbiage in that email, right? Just the verbiage that we use in our society, the vernacular,
right?
But the way that people are treated. Like you mentioned, the sub-nation being treated as subhuman, which is just, it's totally unethical and unfair. What other problems do you see? What are the biggest issues that you see with our mental health care system in America, and what ways do you think that, what do we need to do to fix it?
Well, you know, that's a good question, because they don't really have, they're not a constituency. They don't vote. They don't support candidates. There's not very much incentive for a state representative or a governor to say we must give these people humane care. It does happen. There are some very enlightened politicians in this country. But by and
every state's different. Every state has different laws. Every state has different, you know?
It does. And
sorry to interrupt you.
And those different laws can be very damaging. At the state level, the level of county jails, county sheriffs, they tend to lump mentally ill kids in with hardened criminals. They really, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, but incarceration is about the worst thing you can do. It deepens the psychosis. They're separated from their medications, and often they are thrown into what I think of as our country's worst medieval leftover abomination, solitary confinement. Solitary confinement should get on that fire engine and go away forever. We need to abolish it. It doesn't rehabilitate. It deepens a person's psychosis, and yet it's happening at the county jail level, as you indicated a minute ago, Mary.
Molly, that's fine.
And who am I?
Ron.
Okay. Anyway, it's a truly dire situation. I think if anybody listening to or watching this wants to get involved at any level, join any initiative, any movement that is saying abolish solitary confinement.
I think that can definitely help any person who's, you know, if you spend too much time alone. There are studies even now that showing that loneliness is worse for your health than, you know, than doing illicit drugs. There's studies now that show that loneliness is terrible for you. So you can't imagine that putting yourself in that being locked up in solitary confinement is
sometimes for years.
No way. Yeah. I want to talk to you just about making changes to the system, because there are so many ways that there are so many things that are wrong, so many things that are broken. What are some ways that we can help people that have mental illness?
We need a national champion, Molly. We need a senator, a congressperson, or an inspired activist who is younger and more energetic and smarter than I am to step forward. I'm really very serious about this and say, this is our new civil rights problem. It's our new feminism. It's all of the social ills that Americans have tackled over the past 150 years and conquered. The treatment of the mentally ill is the new one, and it is huge. It affects 4 people in 100. Well, when you start thinking about mothers, fathers, siblings, neighbors, caregivers, it permeates deeply into our society, and it costs us a lot of money. And one of the myths is that it's cheaper to throw them in jail than it is to treat them. It isn't. The reverse is true.
Oh my goodness.
So we just have to do that.
We have to do that. I want to also talk to you about people's lives here, because people's lives are at stake because we're not treating people right. You mentioned, you tell stories about this in your book, you tell stories about this on your blog, which we'll put a link to on our website as well. But police don't always know how to interact with people who have mental illness. If
Yeah.
people are in a psychotic state, the police don't know how to interact with them, or maybe they're not approaching the situation correctly.
Right.
People's lives are lost.
Well, I had to be really careful. I do have several accounts of police, let's be frank, gunning down an unarmed psychotic person in the streets. Now, it's easy to infer from that I am anti-police. I am not. I respect law enforcement. These men who are out, and women who are out there on the front lines, drastically need training.
Yeah.
They need acute, specific training in how to handle people in psychosis. To some extent, departments are starting to get that. We still have a long way to go. And that gets back to the whole question of ignorance, how little our society still knows about one of the most ruinous, not only a disease, but a kind of social phenomenon that is inhibiting all of us in so many ways.
So we need more awareness. We need to talk about this. We
We
need
do.
to break down the stigma, and we all need to be a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more aware, a little bit more accepting, right? So maybe just a little bit kinder.
A lot kinder.
A lot kinder, a lot kinder. And open our hearts and open our minds a little bit, because everyone's a person, right?
Betcha.
Everyone is a person. I want to thank Ron so much for joining us today. Ron, it's been truly enlightening. I'm going to have you sign my book for me once we're done here today. You are speaking at an event tonight here in just a few moments. Why don't you tell us about that
Well, it's the Rhode
briefly?
Island Mental Health Association. It is a splendid group. These are people who advocate, but they really advocate in a highly professional, well-informed, and energetic way. They know the problems. They know the impediments in our state, in Rhode Island state government, a lot of state governments, and they are worth listening to. And it's going to be a real honor and pleasure for me to be among them tonight.
That's wonderful. So if you're interested in hearing more from Ron, the event is at Medicom Country Club. It's free and open to the public, so if you want to hear more from him, you can check that out. It's in a few hours. I believe it starts at 6 o'clock, so double check that on their website. So I'd like to thank Ron again for joining me here. His book is on sale. You can find it at local bookstores or online, of course, but we always like to support local.
Thank you, Molly.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for joining me. Kate Nagel will take things over here at 4 o'clock with news and politics on Go Local Live. Thank you again, once again, for joining us. I'm Molly O'Brien. Have a great rest of you. I'm Molly O'Brien. Have a great rest of you. I'm Molly O'Brien. Have a great